One thing before we get started. This episode contains strong language, so please use discretion. Hi, I'm Emma Clarke, and this is Before the Bar Opens, the podcast about what happens before the music starts. I talk to people who make, use, and love music. Mitch Benn is a comedian, author, satirical songwriter, musician and actor, and is widely acknowledged as one of the best writers and performers of comedy songs in the UK. He's perhaps best known as the resident comic songwriter on BBC Radio 4's The Now Show from 1999 to 2016. Mitch began his comedy career in Edinburgh in the mid-90s before moving to London, and became one of the most in-demand comedians on the UK comedy circuit. He's released many albums of comedy songs and has performed all over the world. Mitch is a weekly columnist for the New European newspaper and has written 3 science fiction novels, Terror, Terror's World and Terror's War. I wanted to know how Mitch combined songwriting with comedy and comedy with politics. What's your first musical memory?
I had a feeling this was going to be the question, actually. And I'm just trying to rack my brains as to what actually is my first musical memory. It could be one of many things. I suspect it's probably sitting on the floor of the living room of the house I grew up in Liverpool. My mum had an old dance set record player. You know, those ones those entirely self-contained ones that used to fold up into like a little tweedy briefcase.
Yeah.
The 2 albums I remember playing over and over again were her copy of the Hard Day's Night album and Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Those are her 2 albums. We used to play those over and over again. I thought I knew what was my first album that I actually owned. Now I think about it, it's between 2. I definitely had, and I think I got it for my 4th birthday, the first Wombles album by Mike Batt. Now, it's not the one with all the singles on, like Remember You're a Womble and all.
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of songs. It's the theme tune, obviously.
Yeah.
And it's a bunch of character songs he wrote for the individual characters. So there's like an Orinoco song, and there's a Wellington song. The Wellington Womble song was probably musically the best one, actually. And I definitely had that when I was 4. But I now also remember I had the Rainbow album, by which I do not mean Richie Blackmore's Post Deep Purple combo of Since You've Been Gone fame Rainbow. I mean George Zippy and Bungle Rainbow. But here's the thing, it was not a Rod, Jane and Freddie album. It was from a pre-Rod, Jane and Freddie era of Rainbow.
I didn't even know there was a pre-Rod, Jane and Freddie era.
Before there was Rod, Jane and Freddie, there was an actual sort of rock band in the studio. And I remember their name was Telltale, Telltale.
No way.
Yes way. And I think they do the Up Above the Streets and Houses, Rainbow Climbing High. I think that's them. And this album was that and a bunch of other sort of tangentially educational songs. But when you were a kid, I suppose you're first exposed to music through TV rather than, well, certainly my generation would have been first exposed to music through TV. So, you know, my earliest memories of pop are probably things like, you know, Mark Bolan on Top of the Pops.
Yeah. When did you realise that music was going to be your thing?
I come from a sort of an unofficially musical family. The last professional musician was actually my great-grandfather, who's a violinist in like musical orchestras in the turn of the century.
Wow.
But almost everybody I'm related to can at least tinker on something. And the curious thing is I grew up in a house full of guitars because my mum and dad both played in folk clubs in Liverpool in the 60s. So there were always guitars around when I was growing up, but I never really took an interest in them until I was about 15. And I had these prerequisite lower middle class few years of piano lessons when I was a kid, you know, and I can still play what I call Beatles piano. Chord bass, chord bass, chord bass, chord bass. You know, I can play Beatles songs on piano. Oh, and that was the other thing. When I was 11 years old in my final year of primary school, my primary school acquired, from where I know not, a double bass. And as the biggest kid in the school, I was basically handed this thing. You, huge boy, play this. Because I was the only kid in the whole school tall enough to even attempt it. So I ended up playing double bass in school orchestra Yeah, right throughout my teenage years. I don't know, I was in a few sort of fairly ropey bands in my later school days. I had a pretty good band when I was at university. I think it was more that I kind of got sucked into comedy in the sort of early mid 90s, which I think is not that unusual. I don't know that many comedians who always wanted to be a comedian when they grew up. Most of us seem to have been distracted into it while we were trying to do other things.
Yeah.
And it was just, even to begin with, obvious that the music was going to be a part of this, that I was going to incorporate my songwriting and my musicianship, if you like, into the comedy. And it just never really occurred to me that I wouldn't. So music has sort of become my thing tangentially. What I was getting paid for the main part was comedy. But the way I was choosing to do that was as a comic songwriter and musical comedian.
How were you discovered?
Have I been? When was it? No. Oh, right. I must have missed that. Well, I don't know. It depends what you mean by discovered. First place I ever did stand-up was in Montreal in the summer of 1991. Long story. I was in the middle of my degree at Edinburgh University. I've been living in Spain all year as a kind of assistant English teacher and playing in a bunch of bands while I was out there, obviously, because almost like the first thing I do when I rock up anywhere is see if there's any bands who are just kicking around who want to have a bit of a jam. So I was playing in a couple of bands while I was in Spain. Played this anarchist rock festival in the middle of nowhere in Spain. That was a weird day. But anyway, I had to spend the summer of 91 somewhere I could practice my French because my degree was Spanish and French. And I got set up with a bunch of improv buddies because I was doing improv at Edinburgh University. It was the other thing I was doing by then. And that was set up by a Canadian guy because it's kind of a Canadian thing. And so I was set up with a bunch of friends of his in Montreal and spent the summer of 91 just hanging out in Montreal and got up at this comedy club to do a bunch of open spots. And it went down really well because I was the only limey in town. I was the only guy doing music, So actually, at the age of 21, I spent the whole of that summer doing stand-up in Montreal and then kind of forgot about it for about 3 years because there wasn't really much of a year-round comedy scene in Scotland until sort of the mid-late 90s. Moved down to London in 96, gigged around the place, got a mobile phone and sort of became the cancellation king. I think this used to be a stage that people sometimes go to when they're edging into the comedy circuit, is you get a bit of a reputation as somebody who you can usually get hold of at short notice and is pretty good, because I'd been gigging solidly up in Scotland for a couple of years before I moved down to London. So I was already quite well practiced before I turned up, despite the fact that as soon as I moved down to London, I had to go right back down to the back of the queue, as it were. I was doing
But you'd done your training effectively. You'd been learning.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of served my apprenticeship away from the prying eyes of the circuit. So I kind of got the really shambolic bit of my career out of the way without anybody having to see it, And then I think what set me in quite good stead as regards getting into the comedy circuit at the end of the night, it was sort of, well, he's new in town and you can usually get hold of him and you can close with him. Because the other thing about me is, because I'm the guitar guy, what it is they like to close with either whoever is the biggest deal or whoever is just, I guess, sort of the biggest presence.
Yes.
And me being a big, loud guy with a guitar, they just, you stick him on at the end. It's not so because he's better than anybody else. It just kind of makes sense from a sort of an internal
You're
dynamic.
a hell of a performer, though, Mitch.
Oh, well, I suppose.
Mitch underplays his skill. He's a phenomenal musician and a hilarious performer. I worked with him on the early series of The Now Show before I had my first child. I've seen how audiences react to him, how he commands the stage. Honestly, he's amazing.
If there was a sort of a moment at which things moved up a notch, this was probably Edinburgh 98. I was in a smallish venue called the Southside, and it pretty much sold out the whole run. And it was probably my first show where I'd written enough really good original songs. Because that's the other thing is, when I started out on the circuit, I was doing what a lot of guitar acts do, which is writing funny words to pop tunes. Yes. I realized quite early on that I had to stop doing that because it's a bit of a dead end. You end up with an act that you don't own.
Absolutely.
You end up dependent upon material that you don't have the copyright to. If you try and do it on record or on the TV or on the radio, then all hell breaks loose. So I realized that quite early on, if I was going to do this properly, I needed to write the tunes and the words as well. And I think 98 was kind of the first show where I'd written enough tunes for that to really work. And it was just a really good show. And somebody who came to see that show was a name which will ring a faint bell with you, was a guy called Aled Evans.
Yes, Aled, yes.
Yes, who was the first producer of The Now Show.
He was.
Which was already up and running. The Now Show had already begun with a couple of other guys doing the songs. And they took a bunch of episodes off in series 2, which was recorded in spring, summer 99. And I was approached to stand in for them for these episodes that they were taking off. And after that, I was the song guy on The Now Show. I don't know whether they left or were fired in favor of me, but thereafter it was my gig. And I was the song guy on The Now Show for 17 years, which in retrospect was far too long. I really should have knocked it on the head after about 10. It was really good fun to do. And I guess whatever profile I have accrued over the years really begins there. I then went through a phase for about the next 7 or 8 years of being all over the radio because Steve and Hugh, Punt and Dennis, were also doing a thing on Radio 2 called It's Been a Bad Week.
Indeed.
Which was kind of the Radio 2 version of The Now Show. And that ran until 2006. And suddenly I was the song guy on that as well. So I was pretty much doing this all year round. Something I have very fond memories of, and a show I think which died before its time, and I do have opinions as to why, but they won't endear me to anybody, was a thing on Radio 2 called Jammin', yes, which I was at least partly responsible for coming up with the idea for, not that anybody in BBC will admit that. And it was essentially a sort of musical game show presented by Roland Riveren, who had also played the drums, and you had sort of 2 in-house musicians, generally either Dave Catlin Birchart, the Bootleg Beatles, or me on the bass, depending on who was available, and either Richard Vranch or Steve Brown tinkering on various keyboards and guitars. And then we would have 2 guests, one of whom was a musical comedian. The obvious ones, we had Rob Deering. We had some comedians you wouldn't necessarily think of as musical, like we had Tim Vine, who's written some pretty good funny songs and can play a bit, And then the other guest would be a musician who was funny. I did one with Nick Kershaw, one with the great Edwyn Collins, one with Mike Edwards out of Jesus Jones, one with Glenn Tilbrook, one with Hugh Cornwell at the Stranglers, And it was a good, fun show. It really was a good, fun show. And it deserved to run for longer than it did. And it should have ended up on BBC 4, because I think it could have had a really interesting visual element if you'd made it almost like a sort of a comedy spin on Later with Jules, something like that. Because obviously, for radio purposes, you had to trim all the kind of fannying about between numbers, because most of it would have been dead air and clanking sounds. But you would have been able to leave more of that in if you'd been able to show what was going on,
Yeah.
Here's the weird thing, particularly the rock stars. So rock stars are often not that great instrumentalists, partly because what you discover is they learn to play their music when they're about 18 or 19. And they've never really learned to play anything else. Do you know what I mean? They've been doing their thing since they're about 18 or 19. So they can play brilliantly their own stuff. And that's it. Whereas the musical comedians, and particularly the house guys, like, obviously, Richard and Steve, and I'll say myself, we're kind of full-time musical parodists. The whole point of us is we can play and sing like everybody. Yeah. Steve Brown can write music like anybody. Richard Vranch can write music like anybody. I can write music like anybody. I can sing like most people. On the few occasions I get to play guitar, one of the things I like to do is I like to try and play guitar like most people. I'm a pretty good singing impressionist, but I'm a very good guitar impressionist. Yeah. I'm very good at playing like famous guitar players, or in the case of the real virtuoso ones, making it sound like I can play like famous.
I caught up with Murray Patt, founder of our proud sponsors, Alexander Knight & Co., the accountants for entrepreneurs, to find out what music means to him. I mean, all accountants love music, right? What do you love about music?
I think with music itself, there's always a song or songs that will help you get through perhaps a dark period. There are always songs that will motivate you. There are always songs that you can just turn to when you need them for whatever reason. And that's the great thing about music. It's for everybody, isn't it? Absolutely everybody.
And everything. You can find a song, a tune, whatever, to fit any mood.
Yes, and that's the brilliant thing about it. And that's what I love about music. And that's why, whilst my taste in music may not appeal to everybody, but there's music that works for me. And that's the great thing about it. And it will be different songs for other people. Describe
your taste in music.
My taste in music probably goes back to the bands that I have seen over the years. People like U2 and Simple Minds. So I've got their entire collection of albums. I've been to see them live. Absolutely amazing.
Big thanks to Alexander Knight & Co, the accountants for entrepreneurs. For the best tax advice, email hello@alexanderknightaccountants.co.uk and find out how much you and your business can save. What's your technique for mimicking great guitarists or idiosyncratic guitarists?
Part of it is finding out what equipment they use and approximating it.
Yeah.
For about 20 years now, I've been playing, particularly when I'm out with my band, I use guitars and some processors by a company called Line 6. They started off in the late 90s, I think, called the Line 6 Pod, which looked like a big red kidney bean. And what it was a digital waveform emulator that reproduced the sounds of all the classic amplifiers.
Oh, wow.
And then in the early noughties, they applied the same technology to guitars. So you could set the guitar to sound like a 1958 Les Paul or a 1962 Stratocaster or an acoustic Gibson Hummingbird or a Rickenbacker 36012 or a National Steel Resonator or a sitar or a banjo, and I got heavily into this company's stuff because it opened up all kinds of possibilities for me, and then particularly if you use sort of the later period floor controllers, you can hook those up to the guitars and you can kind of remote pilot the guitar with the foot controllers. So you can be playing along, just strumming it, and it sounds like a Gibson Dreadnought, and then you stomp on the pedal and suddenly you're playing a 1958 Les Paul through a Supra with a chorus pedal and an auto wah, just go straight from that. Now, you can imagine that makes doing Led Zeppelin parodies a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah.
But then the other thing is, I'm fascinated by music. I'm fascinated by how it's made. And for example, The Edge is technically not a staggeringly brilliant guitar player, but he is an incredibly imaginative user of the guitar to create sounds, to create soundscapes, to create atmosphere, to create mood and everything. And something which is always fun is whenever a new U2 album comes out to have a listen and try and figure out what he's doing this time. What are his new effects? And these are things like that reverse wah sound on Mysterious Ways.
Yeah.
So that doesn't go wah, what you get that noise rather than a wah sound, and just also it's fun to sort of try and figure out the cheats. There are certain cheats you can sound that instantly make you sound a bit more like Jimi Hendrix, like bending up to the same note that you're playing on the string up it. That instantly sounds a bit Hendrixian. Obviously, there are cheats to sounding like Eddie Van Halen. You just do the double-handed tap. Just throw in the double-handed tap and instantly it sounds like, now, I cannot play anything like as well as Eddie Van Halen, but I can throw bits in which make it sound like I can. It's at the heart of parody is that kind of deconstruct and reconstruct thing.
Yeah.
And I quite enjoy applying that process to all kinds of things, not just to somebody's songwriting, but also to the instrument, to the way the instruments are being played, to the production techniques. One of my proudest moments, actually, was when I realized I backed myself into a hell of a corner because I nearly always use GarageBand, which is the cheap and easy recording software that comes free with Apple computers. I have occasionally used Pro Tools and Logic, but by and large, I like using GarageBand because it's so fast. You can only get something about 80% as good on GarageBand as you could get it on Logic, but you can get it that good in about an hour from a standing start.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary the speed you can work with it. Yeah, one time there was a news story, because of course you can only write about what's in the news. You're at the mercy of events. But sometimes the news throws you a bone, So in this occasion, the news story was it was officially made legal to nick expired food out of supermarket bins because homeless people were getting prosecuted for nicking the stuff that was past its sell-by out the wheelie bins around the back of Sainsbury's, despite the fact that there isn't actually anything wrong with it for at least 24 hours or so, and it was keeping them alive.
Yes.
And there was some debate as to whether is this still Sainsbury's property once it's in the bin? Do you not relinquish ownership of something
when you put it
by
in a bin?
putting it in a bin?
Yeah.
And so I wrote this parody of the Bryan Adams Robin Hood song Everything I do for you. I think it was, everything I nick out the bin or something. And so I wrote this, and it had taken me all bloody night to come, because what often happens, I used to leave it till the last minute on purpose a lot of the time, just because if you're writing about an ongoing news story, you already had that 24-hour gap between the show being recorded and the show being broadcast. And sometimes something would happen in that intervening 24 hours
that would completely change.
Totally ruin everything.
And it being called The Now Show.
Yeah, exactly.
It isn't now anymore.
Exactly. So I would deliberately leave things as late as possible. I was up till about 3 a.m. just writing the bones of this song, and then suddenly thinking, hang on, in order to sell this, I need it to sound like the record. So I've now got about 2 hours to do a reasonable facsimile of a 1991 Robert Mutt Lange production. Mutt Lange is legendarily the most overproducing rock producer of all time. He did all Def Leppard stuff in the late 80s. He's married to Shania Twain. He is the king of rock overproduction. Never lay down one guitar track when 12 will do, record each drum on a separate channel. So anyway, I did all kinds of things. Just, right, let's see what we've got. You get the MIDI keyboard out. All right, slave up the piano to the strings so the strings echo everything. Okay, that sounds a bit right. Listening back to it, all the guitars are actually weirdly clean. About 2 weeks of reverb on the snare, and I actually assembled a reasonable facsimile of the sound. Obviously, all the chords and the tune were different because that's where copyright lies. The only copyright is really just in lyrics and melody. You can't even copyright a chord sequence. So the tune is new and the chords are new, but the sound is very evocative of, and so I bunged it out. And we got a complaint from the publishers. They said it used an uncleared sample. Yes!
Oh my God, it was that close.
They thought I'd used an uncleared sample, and it's like, oh my God! I was like, no, this is all me in the MacBook,
That's got to feel like a hell of a victory.
Yeah, it did. Yes.
How do you handle writing songs to a tight deadline? Do you just kind of work through the night?
Yeah, really. I work better to deadlines. I've always worked better to deadlines. If you give me an immovable deadline and a concrete objective, then I can do pretty much anything. It doesn't really matter what it is. If this has to be done by this time or you're screwed, then I go, okay. And it's just something I do at the Distraction Club, and I also sometimes do on my touring shows, is get an idea from the audience or get a bunch of ideas from the audience going into the interval and write something over the interval, and then come out and do it at the beginning of part 2.
That's pressure, that is, isn't it? That is.
Well, yeah, but that's again, it's what makes it work for me. And my ex Chloe used to say things like, I'll be up until like 7 a.m. trying to get the Now Show done. She's like, you do know you can do this in 20 minutes. And I said, yeah, when I have to, I can do it in 20 minutes. So why can't you do it now? Because I know I don't have to. And sometimes people will say to me, and I may even be anticipating another question of yours. The question I get asked all the time about comedy songs is, do you write the tune first? Do you write the words first? I say, neither. You come up with the joke first.
Yes, exactly.
What's the point? What's the joke? What's the angle? What am I trying to do with this? Is this a parody of another artist? In which case that instantly suggests a kind of a shape to the music because you want it to sound a bit like them.
Yeah.
Is this a song about something which maybe evokes a particular musical form? Am I writing an angry marching song? In which case bits of Les Mis are going to start sneaking in because that's kind of what angry marching songs sound like. Am I writing just a nihilistic smash everything song? Because then it's going to start sounding punk because that's kind of what punk evokes. Am I writing something which is a bit silly and overblown and histrionic? In which case we're going to sort of start veering into Iron Maiden territory. You know what I mean? So you start with the angle. What's the joke? What's the story I'm telling? What am I trying to convey here? And that then suggests both lyrical and musical shapes. And that's what you build on. I very rarely begin with one or the other of those. They will sort of evolve in tandem with each other. Possibly because I've very rarely written in collaboration with anybody else. I have on occasion written with collaboration. But there was a song, I was in a sketch show in Edinburgh called the Bootleg Beatles. And it was me, a guy called Zoran Gibson, I don't know where Zoran is now, Ian Lee and Mackenzie Crook.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. And
super group.
Yeah, exactly. And we wanted to do this because it being 99 is sort of the height of the boy band era. We wanted to do this kind of boy band parody for the end. I had written and recorded this backing track for it, and I kept saying I was going to get around to writing words. And then one day Mackenzie said, I've written these words. I hope you don't mind. I think they might be quite good for the closing number. And he'd written these brilliant words for the closing number. And I said, mate, that's just saved my bloody life. There's no ego at stake here. We'll go with these. These are brilliant. So that's one of the few times I've ever collaborated with anybody in writing a comedy song, and I didn't even do it on purpose.
I'm fascinated by the role of the satirist. The stuff they write has to be funny, incisive, entertaining. Sometimes it's scathing, and for some, controversial. I think satirists are essential in a healthy democracy. They show us the world as it is. Satire is powerful. How do you decide what you're going to write a song about? Are you often spoilt for choice? And are there moments when you think, do you know what, I have got no choice but to write this song because I've got to say it. People have got to hear this.
Oh, yeah, sometimes. Probably the last really obvious example of that was back in 2015. In my later Now Show years, unbeknownst to me, I was about a year away from getting kicked off the Now Show. But it was in early 2015, and it was our first show back in that series. And most of it had been written. So I had a couple of songs more or less ready to go. And then on the Wednesday night was when the Charlie Hebdo massacre happened in Paris.
Yes.
And then it moved on to then you had, this similar gun battle in the kosher deli. And this is all kicking off in Paris. And I remember saying to the producers, we can't not do this. I know there's nothing remotely funny about this, but we can't not do this because it's tangentially about us. It's about people being literally murdered at their desks for doing our job. And if we decide that means that we can't talk about it, we've essentially done the bad guys' work for them, because what they want is for people to stop cracking jokes about them. I wrote this song called Still Gonna Do It. It is the job of satirists to poke fun at the self-important, whether they are self-important in a governmental way or self-important in a kind of theocratic walking around with a machine gun kind of way, and
it still takes a lot of guts to write stuff like that, I think, Mitch.
Well, it took guts for them to broadcast it. That was what I was impressed with, because they were shitting bricks when I said this. I said, I think I can do this in a way that will work. Let me go away and write this. And I'm more than happy to run this by half a dozen times and send it through, legal, however many times you want. But I think we have to at least try to address this.
Which of your political songs do people really love, and which ones are more likely to unearth the trolls?
It's both. It's the same ones. Yeah, I wrote a song about Brexit in 2018. What was really driving me nuts was the staunch Brexiters blaming the Remainers for the fact that it was going wrong. And it's like, oh, fuck you on every conceivable level, So I wrote this song called Own Your Shit, and put it up as a YouTube and on Twitter and Facebook and everything. And it went properly viral. It got, quite a lot of attention and everything. And it still comes around every now and again. Sometimes I will repost it. Sometimes somebody else will repost it. And it gets me more support and more grief than pretty much anything else, So
How do you cope with trolls? Do they get to you?
No, they don't. No, not at all. Not even slightly. I'm bigger, I'm smarter, I'm uglier, and I was here first.
What happens when the music stops, when you've played a gig, when you've published a new song? What do you do then?
Well, it's a very different set of circumstances. When you played a gig, you flog a bit of merchandise, you say hello to a bunch of people. Then, in my case, you dismantle all your own shit and load it into the back of the motor. It was kind of always an ambition of mine to become a big enough deal that I could watch some other poor bugger dismantle my shit and load it into the van. But we never got that far, And if it's been a good one, you drive home with the feeling of a job well done. When you publish a song on the internet, then basically you just think, okay, now what? Let's see what happens. And sometimes you can't help feeling they deserve more. I wrote a song called Pose with a Phone about the way that politicians, when it becomes apparent that they don't know their arse from a hole in the floor, or that a situation has just totally gotten away from them, they release a photograph of them sitting at their desk with a serious face on, holding a phone. And it's always the phone. You know, they're always, I have my serious face and I want to go, look at me in charge of events. And I wrote this song called Pose with the Phone and did one of my slightly more elaborate videos for it. And I put that up and I didn't get a bloody thing. And I'm thinking, I'm slightly annoyed by that because I thought that deserved more. But for example, just before that, there was that story of Michael Gove apparently off his tits rocking up at a disco in Aberdeen. So I wrote just a complete throwaway bit of nonsense about that called Michael Gove is Raving. And that got way more than the one I put all the time and effort into.
Funny.
Sometimes you can never tell. I mean, the really big one I wrote a song called Fuck All about how when lockdown was first invoked and we were all told to stay indoors and everything and people just weren't doing it. And I was thinking, this is really the first time in living memory and possibly since the war that the British people have been called upon as a nation to do anything. And the thing we've been called upon to do is nothing. And apparently we can't even get it together to do that. So I wrote this stirring martial call to arms song and put it up on all the usual channels and thought nothing of it. And within about 72 hours, it became apparent that literally everybody in the world had seen it. People were messaging me saying, my boss put this on the company WhatsApp feed. So all 200,000 people at the company saw it this morning. Ironically enough, given what it was about, it went properly viral. And I had no idea that had that kind of potential. I just thought, again, it was just a bit of fun about being stuck indoors. So that song went mental. There were people listening to that podcast who just thought, oh, wait, it's that guy.
All the show notes for this episode are available in the description, and there's a bunch more stuff at beforethebaropens.com. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, just take your pick. Before the Bar Opens is created by me, Emma Clarke, and is produced by Rick Watson. I compose the theme music we use on Before the Bar Opens, and you can hear the full piece on our website, beforethebaropens.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, hopefully a lovely one, and tell your friends. Another episode will be along very soon, so don't miss it. Thanks for listening.